Hello fellow cinephiles, 90s Film Guru here, thanks for joining me today. Today I'll be reviewing Gus Van Sant's remake of Psycho. Now, I know a lot of people dislike this film, they think it's pointless, a shot-for-shot remake, in colour, with a whole new cast, and you have to ask why would they do this since they've already got the original. But I just feel there's something about this film. No, it doesn't come close to the original, of course not. That's his own thing. That's Hitchcock at his peak, and he created such a really wonderful black and white thriller horror film, and really introduced us to Norman Bates and the Bates Motel, which I thought was great. But there's just something about this. This is an interpretation of that. Yes, there are very similar shots and sequences in the film. Not everything's exactly the same. But I think where Gus Van Sant really shines with this film is just what he does with the characterization, what he does with the characters and the performers and actors he's got in to play these particular roles. Yes, some of them still feel very similar of the original characters, especially Anne H. and William H. Macy, and even down to Viggo Mortensen's performance. But there's just something about what he does with it that is really intriguing to me. But it's really the performances by Vince Vaughn and Julianne Moore that I really love. Their interpretation of it, where everybody was kind of similar and trying to be that like their original character, or even perform it like the original actors did in the original film from the 60s. These two kind of interpreted it differently, and they gave the performance of how they felt that how the character should be in the film. And I kind of like that. I think Vince Vaughn is really great, I think, as Norman Bates. No, he does nothing on Anthony Perkins because that was unique, but there's just something about the character that feels different. He's a bit more conniving, a bit more smarter. And you're not quite sure what he's going to do next. And there's sort of a real darkness in him, like he's wearing a mask. And I kind of like that, Anthony Perkins is really good as Norman Bates, but you don't kind of get that. He's more of a bumbling, sort of odd character, where Vince Vaughn's character feels very different, and I like that. And Julianne Moore's exactly the same. She plays Lila Crane, Marion's sister, who goes to find her. That was originally played by Vera Miles, who's great in the original, but there's just something about the way she plays it. Julianne Moore has said that she wanted to kind of create a contrast between Marion and Lila, and she really does that. She's much more aggressive and takes charge and wants to know what's going on, and she's kind of a character you kind of standoffish a little bit with, and I kind of like that. I just think her two performances really make this kind of a unique take and interpretation on this particular story. For those who haven't seen it or had no real interest in seeing it because it's a remake, only follows the same story. Marion Crane takes some money and goes on a trip. She's trying to get to her lover's place, played by Viggo Mortensen this time round, and she's trying to pay off his debts so she can ultimately help him out. And of course she gets stuck in a storm, ends up at the Bates Motel, and she meets Norman Bates, who seems nice enough but a little strange. And ultimately she ultimately is killed by his mother, and it's about her sister Lila and partner coming together to try and work out what's going on and trying to ultimately find what happened to Marion, where William H. Macy's character comes in as a private detective, is hired to do so. Then it unfolds from there, and then it becomes Lila's story about trying to work out where her sister is, what happened to her, and what part Norman Bates plays in the whole thing. From the research I've found, ultimately Gus Van Sant was a huge fan of the original film. Like, it was one of his favourite movies, and he even went as far as to make a sort of spoof Psycho shampoo commercial when he was in film school, sort of making it comical but paying homage to a film he really loved. And from a director who's come from mostly independent cinema and really didn't have a huge budget or do anything, it wasn't until Good Will Hunting came about and the success of that, he was able to do whatever he wanted. And he saw this as a chance to really do a remake of a film he's always loved. Now, his choices to make it shot for shot even shocked the producers, and I don't know if that was such a great idea to do it shot for shot. But like I said, he sort of injected something into this that sort of made it feel slightly different, even though it was mostly a shot-for-shot remake. And look, you can't fault a guy, a filmmaker, doing that, making a film, remaking a film he really loved. It makes sense to me, even if it wasn't as well received or even considered anything good because of the fact of what it was. Pretty much a passion project for him. And when he told his producers that he wanted to do shot-for-shot remake, they were a little concerned, of course, but they allowed him to do what he needed to do. But as he was making the film, he found that it was really hard a lot of times to do shot-for-shot because it took so long for them to set up and try and get these particular scenes done properly. So he just sort of did his own thing. So it is shot-for-shot, but not completely. I also found like original casting was meant to be Nicole Kidman was meant to play Marion Crane, which I don't quite see, in my opinion. Like she's a solid actress, especially in the 90s, but I just don't see her as this character, and ultimately it was because of schedule conflict that she couldn't do it. And at one stage after that, Drew Barrymore was considered. That could have been kind of interesting, as she was sort of a bit controversial in the 90s and was sort of doing unique and interesting roles and things in her personal life, so it could have been interesting, but ultimately it went to Anne H. And I think Anne H is fantastic here as Marion Crane, a really underrated actress who we sadly lost recently. And I think she does really great performance in it. She sort of gives the character much more anxiety and much more things going on than we saw in the original film. And I kind of like that. She feels slightly fresh on a character we've known for many years. Look, I've always been a fan of this film. When I first got into watching movies, the original Psycho was one of the first older films I ever really saw, but I only saw snippets of it because I was in a music class and they were talking about the impact of music on cinema and particular sequences. And with this scene we saw from Psycho, which I think was kind of the opening scene with Marion and the other character, and I just saw it with the music, there's no dialogue, and I was just so absorbed and transfixed by this imagery I saw that it fascinated me. But it would be many years later before I actually saw the film. When I started watching especially horror or older movies, I'd always watch the newer one, the new sequel, the remake or such. And so because of that, I have a sort of a slight fascination with these sort of early remakes. And this was one of them. But once I saw the original, I enjoyed that much more. But I just kind of liked the take on what they did here, and because it was my first introduction to characters in this world, it sort of holds a certain love for it in a way, certain place for me. And it's a film I've gone back to from time to time. I think what the film does really well as well, that is what the original did as well. The original really captured the 60s in the look, the feel, the clothing, the costumes, the acting, everything felt of that period. And this film really feels like the 90s. No one has a mobile phone, it's sort of old school sort of look and feel, and I know it's trying to connect back to the original, but it sort of feels modern without having modern technology, and I like that. I feel this was a film, if they tried to remake it now, it wouldn't work. There's too much technology unless they set a different period of time. So if they were going to remake it, the 90s was the only era that they could really do it. Like I mentioned, this is a good cast. A lot of them were unknown, especially Vince Vaughn and up-and-comers. And Julianne Moore and William H. Macy and Viggo Mortensen have kind of been around, but they hadn't really broken out, so to speak, just yet. Later in their career they would do that, but this is a kind of an interesting introduction to them, to be in a film that most people hated but gave great performances nonetheless. I think he gathered a great cast in that regard. By choosing a great cast, lesson's one thing the director has to worry about, because he casts that person because he knows that they can perform, and he allows them to do that and gives them the space to that, which he did with Julianne Moore and Vince Vaughn in their interpretation of the characters they were playing. And you've got to respect him for that. He's a smart director in that regard. And like I mentioned, I think Vince Vaughn's a standout here as Norman Bates, very different interpretation than Anthony Perkins, and I like that, and it feels fresh and unique. There are some scenes where you're like, oh, I don't know if they should have done that, but it's kind of the character they're creating that is creepy and odd and strange. And also what I did notice through the film that I hadn't noticed before is Right at the end, where they've captured him and the psychologist is talking to him, and then the psychologist, played by the late great Robert Foster, he explains that Norman Bates' mind is completely gone. It's only his mother's taken over. And I didn't really think about how we sort of saw that through the film, and we kind of did. There was moments that felt like him, and there was a lot of moments that didn't. But there's one particular shot that's in the original as well, where William H. Macy's character, Arbogast, goes to investigate and is ultimately killed by Norman. And Norman once again dumps the car in the back, out the back, in the swamp sort of lake, out the back of the Bates Motel. And then Viggo Mortensen's character arrives and starts looking for Arbogast and kind of yelling out, and then you see Norman sort of turn and look, and he's really slender in this, turtleneck and stuff. But you see the shot and you're like, that's his mother. You can see it's his mother. You can tell it's not him anymore. And he didn't have to put on the wig and the clothes to be his mother. So psychologically, he always was. Becomes more and more like her, and in that moment you really see that. And then you start to think of the other scenes in the film before this sequence, and you can see little bits and pieces, the way he's Norman in his sort of lightness and the way he's talking, and then the talking turns, especially a particular scene with Marion and Norman, where he's giving her something to eat and he started to talk about people, and she's saying you should put your mother in care and all of this sort of stuff, and he gets aggressive. It's kind of like he's going in and out of himself and his mother, and I kind of like that. I thought that was really clever and an interesting thing, and it's just something I never noticed before. Where in the original, I never quite felt that with Anthony Perkins's character. I never really thought about when it was his mother unless he was dressed up as her. So it's kind of, that's one thing that Vince Vaughn and Gus Van Sant brought to the film that was kind of different. And I thought it was kind of interesting. Like, I keep going on about Vince Vaughn and Julianne Moore because they're my favourite aspects of the movie. But Gus Van Sant allowed them to perform, allowed them to take the interpretation and craft the character themselves, which not a lot of directors do. Not a lot of directors have a lot of faith in their actors to give the performances that they see in their mind, but he was coming from independent cinema. He was allowing them to be free, and that's why their performances are the best in the movie, because he allowed them the opportunity to do that, and they were the only actors who chose to do that, and it really shines through on screen. I also think having the film in colour gives it another level, because it's sort of the way things are done. We sort of get a texture and a feel, and it's sort of a taste of what this Bates Motel and the world really feels and looks like. Where in the 60s with the original film, it works for black and white, absolutely, but I think just putting colour into it adds something else to it. Like I said, like, it is shot for shot, but there are different things in it, from performances, the fact it's shot in colour, and just certain sequences that are a little different. Another standout for me is William H. Macy. I think he's fantastic in this film. He feels like a character from the original movie or from that period. He plays it so well. And even the acting feels like it's from the 60s. And I kind of thought that was great. All the acting kind of feels like that, except for the two actors I mentioned. And that sort of is an interesting way to go about doing those particular characters. There's so many aspects to the movie I do enjoy. I know it's not for everybody, and I know people will probably hate the fact that I do like it, because why would you like something like this? But it's all interpretation. That's how I look at remakes these days. Look at Halloween. The original Halloween, John Carpenter's Halloween, is fantastic. It's one of my favourite horror movies of all time. But I can appreciate Rob Zombie's version of it. And that's kind of what I feel with this film. Like, I'm a big fan of the original Psycho. It's one of my favourite classic films. But there's just something about what is done with this that I really love, the interpretation. And the fact it just feels like, and is so drenched in the 90s, which is exactly what I started this channel for. And I think this film really captures that era quite well. It has its issues, but overall I do enjoy this film. I want to give the Psycho remake 3.5 out of 5. A solid film in my opinion. Not completely perfect, does have small issues, but I still enjoy the interpretation of it. It doesn't come close to the original, but it has a different feel for me than Hitchcock's version. In the end, I like this film. I'd watch it occasionally. I'm sure there are many people who don't, but I just would. I'd be interested to see if someone watched it now and really thought about what it was trying to do, and whether they enjoyed it now compared to when it first came out and didn't do real well at the box office at all. So I would be interested to see you guys watch it. Someone watch it and leave some comments of what you thought of it. I just could want to see what other people thought of this movie, because I am a fan of it. And I think it's definitely worth another watch. Anyway, that's all from me today. Thanks for watching. Hope you enjoyed this video, and if you did, please subscribe down the bottom. Follow me on Letterboxd and Facebook. Otherwise, until next time, enjoy the movies.